Hello, everybody, and welcome to our lecture on historic fires in North America. The goal of this lecture is to get you familiar with the historic fires that have happened in North America that have had some impact on our policies and how we see contemporary wildfires. These are mostly going to focus on wildfires, although there are some that are linking into some urban fires as well. So one of the first things we have to understand is the difference between a natural phenomena, a natural hazard, a hazardous event, and a natural disaster. So like first fire is a natural phenomena. These are things that happen all the time, all over the place. These are physical events, volcanic eruptions, wildfires, hurricanes, earthquakes that don't have an effect on human beings. So if it doesn't have an effect, it is considered a natural phenomena, but not a hazard. So if there's an earthquake in the middle of the Pacific and it doesn't create any sort of impact on humans, it's a natural phenomena. A hazard, on the other hand, are natural phenomena, atmospheric, hydrological, geological, and wildfires that, because of their location, severity, frequency, have the potential to affect humans, their structures, or other activities. So a hazard is the potential for an event to occur that would have some sort of impact on humans. So a natural phenomena that is something that doesn't have an effect. A hazard is something that might have an effect. A hazardous event is something that does have an impact on humans. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily a disaster. So we get earthquakes in California all the time. And matter of fact, we get earthquakes multiple times a week. If you're in other places, you might get multiple earthquakes a day. But these are small earthquakes that occur in a populated area, but it may not have had a significant impact on humans. So that brings us to a natural disaster. A hazardous event that causes unacceptably large numbers of fatalities or overwhelming property damage is a natural disaster. So in a hazardous event, your house may shake, there might be a few cracks or something like that. It's an event, it's hazardous. But if we got a 8.7 earthquake in the middle of downtown LA and half the buildings in LA collapsed, that would be a disaster. Actually, a great example is the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 as an example of a natural disaster. Before people had built up that area and there were just some people there, it would be a hazardous event or a natural hazard. And when there weren't people in San Francisco at all, it was just a natural phenomena. Now, there's a number of ways that we can figure out what are the natural hazards in our area. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, actually has created a whole website where you can go and explore this. It has all of this is their risk index. There are 18 natural hazards that they're looking at. And so these are the 18 that they're considering. And we're going to look at a couple of these just to give you a feel of where they might occur. And because I was just talking about earthquakes, we're going to start with earthquakes. So when we look at this data, you can see here on the Ring of Fire, where we live, we have a very high to a relatively high risk of having a natural hazard, and even more so a natural disaster. We can actually scroll in on this. We can look at this map in an interactive way. So if we look down here in San Luis Obispo, you'll see that we're kind of yellow. We're not red. And that's because of our relationship to faults like the San Andreas Fault. Now, we have a whole bunch of small faults here in the county that could pose some of these risks, but they don't think any of them are large enough to trigger a big earthquake. On the other hand, the San Andreas kind of runs right through here, and that's part of the reason why these areas are much more likely to have problems. Now, if you're in places like the middle of the country, they don't have fault lines. They don't get natural earthquakes. Now, what is happening in places like Oklahoma, you can see they're going to yellow. That's because of fracking. They are injecting water into old fault lines that's causing some seismic activity that's never really happened there. So these aren't natural hazards, they're man-made hazards. Now over here, you'll see this chunk of yellow. This is the Madrid Fault. This has actually had several pretty significant earthquakes on it before. We can go back and look at wildfire. This class, we're particularly interested in wildfire. And you'll see some areas of blue, but there is a lot of yellow and red when we look at these the possibility of this being a natural disaster, including all over parts of the Midwest. If you look at Florida and on the coast, these areas have very high potential for wildfires as well. And you can look up here in the Northeast, there's some potential for wildfires as well. Matter of fact, there was just a wildfire in New Jersey last year, and then there's been several in North Carolina, and these are mostly Everglade and bayou fires. So you can see actually pretty high risk of wildfires in a lot more of the country than we really think about. I mean, here's the Dakotas, right? Like whoever would be looking at the Dakotas going, oh, wildfire land. Well, guess what? Wildfire land. The Michigan, couple very big fires have happened in Michigan and Wisconsin and up in those areas as well. A couple of them we'll talk about today. If we look at tornadoes, something we don't get here, right? So you can see, here is Tornado Alley, right? We very rarely get tornadoes. But here's Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska, and they get tornadoes all the time. So this is actually a very good resource if you're ever wondering about what are the types of disasters that might be occurring in your area. Or if you're ever doing a project for a different class where you need to look at hazards. So we're going to be talking about historic fires today, and it's important for us to understand the fire history of North America. This is particularly focused on the United States to get a good feel as to what the potential for fire is. And this particular map looks at fire return or fire frequency. How often does fire return to the landscape? This is prior to 1850, where we see a lot of exploration of the center of the United States. So this is giving us a feel of a 200 period of time. It is also before industrialization. So this map would shift today, one, because of fire suppression, and two, because of climate change. Now, what you can see is here on the coast of California and up in the Sierra Nevadas, we have quite a bit of fire frequency. This is a fire return rate between 6 and 8 years. If you look at the Great Plains, right, lots of fire, very frequent fires. These darker reds are about 2 to 4 years. These oranges are 4 to 6. All of this yellow is somewhere between 10 and 14 years. So about once a decade, most of the country has fire return. There are exceptions, right? So we don't get a lot of fire in the Mojave Desert and some of these other desert areas. The fire return in these places are pretty rare. And same up here in the Pacific Northwest, mostly because they get a lot of rain. Same with up here, we don't have a ton of fire return, and that's because of rain. So when the first Europeans arrived in the 1600s, and I'm thinking through actual colonization as opposed to some of the visits we saw from the Vikings that we see up in Canada and places like that. I'm thinking more concerted colonization is what I'm talking about. So the first European settlers recognized the need that they needed some sort of fire in their lives. They needed fire for agriculture, fire for warmth, fire for cooking. So fire was important as a tool, but not important in terms of wildfires. European fire regimes are very different than North American fire regimes. And Europeans, one, they've deforested Europe a multitude of times. And so lumber is considered a very valuable asset for a whole host of things. We've talked about pottery and forges and food and things like that. We talked about the different metal of burning of stones and how that plays out. And so when they get to North America, they see forests abound, tons and tons of forests. And these are considered valuable resources. One, because they want to build their homes and their ships out of them, but also they see them as potential resources for industry. It's also important to European settlers as a way to clear land, right? So we've talked about the use of slash and burn as part of agriculture. And so when European settlers, most of whom are coming from the United Kingdom, from Spain, from France, the Dutch, some Germans are coming over to the United States, well, what will become the United States, they're bringing their own burning and agricultural practices with them. And they're imposing them on the landscape. One, through as much fire suppression as they can, but also through burning for agriculture. And so they're imposing their fire regimes on North America in a way that the North American ecosystems don't do well. And partially this is because fire is always a threat when we're thinking through what's going on. And we've talked about the materials that they're building their homes out of. Now, there's a real lack of planning, right? So there's not city planners landing in America thinking through the best layouts for Jamestown or the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Although there might, maybe they should have, but there wasn't. And so part of what we see is a haphazard development of these communities. So there's a lack of planning for housing, sanitation, water supply, infrastructure needs that we know that they have to some degree in Europe, but we're not seeing that really being applied here in the early colonies. And part of that is because the speed at which these colonies are being built. We're seeing decent influxes of populations in order to keep them supplied, but also the idea is to bring more people to the United States to colonize them. It's also to relieve the overpopulation that's occurring in Europe at the time. And so because of the ways in which these communities are developed, we do see the potential of fire becoming a very big possibility in burning down a number of these colonies. And by the way, we do see a number of these colonies have fire as a major problem and do burn down. And partially because the materials that they're using are easily burned. We're using lumber as our primary materials. We're using thatch as our primary roofing materials. And these are very flammable materials. Also, when you cut down a tree, you have a lot of wood chips and sawdust and things like that that get left behind. And all the branches, you just kind of clean the tree off of all the branches, and that is all left behind. That dries out, and that slash, all that's called slash, actually increases the fire load of the forest. So we've talked about it's really hard to set a tree on fire, but it's really easy to burn wood chips. And this is the same thing that's going on here. We have a lot more dry fuels, fine fuels in terms of sawdust and wood chips and branches that are laying around the forest. So if there's a lightning strike or some other spark, there's a lot more materials that can be caught on fire and start a forest fire. And of course, firefighting is being done by bucket brigades. And we have talked a little bit about how ineffective that can be. We do see fire pumps start to come in play eventually, but that takes a minute. So when we talk in terms of the context of colonization of North America, couple things to keep in mind as we go through and talking about these specific fires. The first is that we're imposing fire regimes that are not part of the natural ecosystem. The second thing is that we are building kind of haphazardly in ways that can help fire spread, especially to areas where we have settlers. And it's not just settlers that are impacted by this fire, by the way. Native peoples are incredibly impacted by this fire and these practices. They have adapted and found fire useful in their lives in ways that Europeans find threatening. And so those fire techniques are actually being suppressed as settlement happens, and as Native peoples lose their land. And as they suppress fire, they're also losing access to food sources, resources, housing materials that they might have had European settlement not happen. So our first major fire that we're going to talk about happens in 1885, and this is the Miramichi Fire. I use this fire because this is a really good example of a pretty typical fire between the 1600s and the 1800s. Now, this fire is pretty big. It is a notable fire, but it represents kind of a typical fire that might occur from all of these issues around settlement. So on the evening of October 7th in 1825, a firestorm roared through New Brunswick and parts of Maine. So this whole area here, there's Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. So here is what will become Maine. There's a lot of disputed boundaries. So the fire that we're talking about is happening kind of in this area. So up in Maine, we have a huge logging industry, and same within New Brunswick. These are major logging areas where we're seeing what I just talked about. As the forests are cleared, we have all of this slash laying around. And so that kind of sets up the situation. We have a number of small towns. The small towns are represented by dots. This is Halifax, here's Chatham, Newcastle, Bangor, Quebec City up in Quebec, Montreal, just to kind of orient you where this is. And so on the evening of October 7th, we actually see a firestorm start to roar through these areas. Now, all these little triangles are areas where we think there was already fires that were going on. Again, this is a pretty hot summer. There's not a lot of wind. There's not been a lot of rain. So we have the drying out of fuels taking place. And what we think happened is that there was a foresting camp where the fire that they were using in the camp got away from them. That's what they think happened. It is totally possible, by the way, that this is caused by a lightning strike. Like, those two things are not necessarily separate. But what we do know is there's hot, dry weather. There are high winds, lots of logging slash. And like I said, it's likely started with embers from a campfire in the middle of this logging area, getting into the slash and starting what starts out as a pretty small fire, but we're relying on bucket brigades to try and put this out, and it quickly gets away from them. So in less than 3 hours, it reduces the town of Newcastle to almost nothing. Of the 260 buildings in town, only 12 remain. And there's several adjacent towns in this area, like Douglastown, and Moorfield, all of which are totally destroyed from this firestorm. Now, what's controversial about this fire is we think that this is where it is, but there is also a similar fire happening in Maine on the same day at the same time. And so with this particular complex, we have a lot of controversy about what country this happened in. And so we have two different narratives. So this kind of brings in this idea of geopolitical artificial boundaries, right? All of this area is forest. All of this area can burn. Mother Nature does not respect where America and Canada decide to draw artificial boundaries. So we have stories of the Miramichi fire occurring in Maine, and we have stories of the Miramichi fire occurring in Canada. And for a pretty big chunk of time, we have these two separate stories, and they're treated as two separate fires. But they're probably the same fire because they butt up on each other. This fire is notable, one, because of its destructive capacity, but also because of the fact that we have two countries, two boundaries, not talking to each other about what's going on. And this is currently not as much of an issue. The United States and Canada are pretty good neighbors to each other. We get along really well. So that's not really a big deal, but this is a good example. And we have a multitude of other fires that occur in these border areas that are coming from lumber camps or lightning fires getting into the slash. So that's why I use this as one of my examples. Peshtigo fire. This fire is big. This fire is big. It's well known. It has a lot of impact, especially in Wisconsin and Michigan, around fire policy. It also has the overlap of exactly the same date as the Great Chicago Fire, which is the video you guys just watched, which is why this fire isn't as well known, because the Great Chicago Fire was the Great Chicago Fire, and Chicago got a lot more press coverage than the Peshtigo Fire did. So just like the conditions that set up the Great Chicago Fire, we see the same conditions happening not that far away here in Michigan and Wisconsin. So the fire started on October 8th, 1871. It burnt 3.7 million acres in Wisconsin and Michigan. It is one of the deadliest fires ever. It killed between 1,200 and 2,500 people. We lost a lot of acreage, and depending upon your estimates, it's between 1.2 and 3.7 million acres. It was, like I said, we have the same situation going on. We have drought, a hot summer. This whole area is forested, and we have tons of logging going on. So we have all of that slash left over. We also have railroads going in to clear out some of these areas. And we know that railroad workers left a lot of brush piles next to the track. Now, back in the day, trains actually let out sparks. So if I've got brush piles along the side of tracks and I've got trains spewing sparks out of the train, the odds of those brush piles getting set on fire and causing a disaster goes up a lot. So we are going to watch a very short video on this. It's a really good video, and it takes place up in the town of Peshtigo.
Wildfires this year have destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres, hundreds of homes, and killed more than 20 people. They actually still don't compare to the deadliest wildfire in history. In 1871, Wisconsin's Peshtigo fire killed more than 1,200 people. News 13's Bob Martin has the story from Wisconsin.
In 1871, the woods surrounding the bay north of Green Bay were full of sawmills. Loggers were harvesting tall white pines. Thousands of immigrants from around the world poured in. As soon as they got off the ships,
they were all there working. You could get a job almost immediately.
Other trees and brush that interfered with logging or clearing farmland were slashed and burned on the spot. Using fire as a tool caused problems. Intentional burns often got out of hand, and crude bucket brigades could only douse small fires. Then, on the night of October 8th, after months of drought, a deep low-pressure system spawned hurricane-velocity winds throughout the region. Small blazes exploded and merged into one enormous firestorm. It surrounded Peshtigo.
They said it sounded like 20 locomotives. The noise was immense. It was like a numbing, unbelievable. I think that was it. They couldn't believe that ordinary, what they were used to, a forest fire, was that big, and there was nowhere to go.
Within a matter of 15 to 20 minutes, the whole city was burning at one time. I can't imagine what was going through those people's minds. They knew they had to run for their life.
Survivors would tell of fireballs blasting through town, smashing into people and buildings, instantly igniting them. In Peshtigo, scores of those who were trapped by the rapidly advancing flames took refuge here in the waters of the Peshtigo River.
They had to fight domestic animals, wild animals, boats, just terrible people fighting for a spot, really. People that couldn't swim actually wouldn't get in the river, and they burned at the river's edge.
When the sun came up, the bodies of 800 people, almost half the population of Peshtigo, lay in the charred rubble. In one night, what residents described as swirling fire tornadoes had burned more than a dozen towns. In Williamsonville, flames chased the 77 residents into open fields. 60 are dead. Some reportedly took their own lives as the fire closed in. Tornado Park now memorializes the fire tornado's victims. Experts say the full death toll across the region was probably about 2,500. Today, a small museum in Peshtigo houses artifacts like a melted watch, a scorched Bible. Next door, a mass grave for 350 victims who were never identified. All of the original white pines in the area were ultimately clear-cut. There is only one small stand of towering old-growth white pines left. The wife of a lumber baron had 20 acres spared to serve as a place of reflection. Bob Martin, KRQE News 13, near Peshtigo, Wisconsin.
The Peshtigo fire is sometimes called the Forgotten Fire because on the same night in 1871, the city of Chicago burned down. The Great Chicago Fire killed 250 people.
So part of the reason why we're not really sure how many people actually perished in this fire is one, because when those towns burnt down, so did the town records. So all of the Bibles or birth certificates or anything like that were gone. Also, during this kind of chaotic time of immigration, people were very mobile. And so people might have moved from town to town to town, and we may not, other people may not have known where they were. There's also a lot of logging camps all up in this area as well. And so we don't necessarily know who was in those logging camps. So this is actually one of the really big fires. This fire gets Michigan and Wisconsin to really start thinking, how do we engage in firefighting? How do we prevent some of this? So some of it actually ends up being prevented because they cut all the forests down, right? You're not going to have logging slash laying around or brush piles laying next to train tracks when you don't have forests. I don't know that that was ecologically the best way to go, but that's partially what happened. So the next fire is the Thumb Fire. About 10 years after the Peshtigo Fire, Michigan was devastated again by the Thumb Fire in September of 1881. Same sort of thing that happened. We have settlers pouring into the area, We have lots of logging going on, lots of industry coming into the area. We have about, again, 2 million acres, and about 3,000 structures were burned, right? So here is the area in which this occurred. This is where the district occurred. It was a big fire. So this is all here in the Upper Peninsula. If we go back over here, it's very similar, very close to that area. The fire sent enough soot and ash into the atmosphere that we see it impact the East Coast, very similar to the Peshtigo and the Chicago fire sent a lot of soot and ash up into the air, and we see them impact the air quality in New England. And we have newspaper articles from different towns in New England talking about it being like twilight at noon. Couple things that the thumb fire represents, right? So we start to have this conversation around fire prevention in Wisconsin and Michigan with the Peshtigo fire. We also see here that the Red Cross starts to become involved in natural disasters. This is actually the first time that the Red Cross responded to a major fire, shipping food and supplies for about 14,000 residents that were displaced by the fire. After this particular fire, we start to see official firefighting plans. Because remember, this is only 10 years after the Peshtigo fire. And people start to go, yeah, this is major fires in a decade. This is, short periods of time that we're seeing this major firestorm happen up in the Midwest. And to just remind you that when we looked at how often fire returns to the landscape, every 10 to 20 years is about right for this space. And that's what we're seeing here. So we start to see firefighting coming into play. We see timber barons suffering from these huge losses from the forest fire. So we start to see the development of the Northern Forest and Northern Forest Protection Association to manage forest fires in Michigan. This is eventually gets superseded by the U.S. Forest Service, but this is kind of one of the predecessors to the U.S. Forest Service. We also see the Ford Motor Company, who also owned huge tracts of land, start to do some conservation and cleanup, maintaining their own fire towers and having timber patrol, and start to see the importation of more technologies, not just bucket brigades, but really starting to see pumps coming in. And this fire also represents the start to the end of the lumber industry in Michigan. And if you were to go up into Michigan, you'd see a lot of remnants of these forests that have been left behind, but mostly they've been turned into agricultural land. Now, this story is very similar to the same stories that we see that we talked about when we talked about Gilgamesh, and when we've talked about some of these other societies that deforested their land and some of the impacts that had. Our next fire is the Cape Cod fire. Now, this was a little bit different because this is an industrial fire. So after the Iron Age, we start to get into what's considered the age of glass, the glass age. And starting to get into the steel age. Glass requires a good bit of heat to melt. Glass is, we don't even think about the creation of glass today, but historically it's a pretty laborious process. But glass is, even in the 1800s, in such demand as we see this boom of immigrants coming into the United States and these huge building booms, glass becomes in demand. And so we have demands for glass in both housing and commercial settings, and it's cheap and it's plentiful. And the cheap cost of having glass in your town encourages more and more entrepreneurs to set up glass factories. So in 1875, a huge forest fire burned 25,000 acres in the Sandwich area. This is Sandwich, this is Cape Cod, right? Here's Provincetown, here's Falmouth, here's Sandwich, here's Plymouth. We see this whole area become burned because of this fire that happens in this glass factory. So you have a factory here that's making glass, and one of the things you need to have on hand is a large quantity of fuel. So this glass factory has 600 cords of stacked wood, because you have to dry it out enough that you can turn it into fuels for the running of the glass factory. We also have several stands of oak and pine pretty close by that are in the process of being cut down. So again, we have 600 cords of drying or dried wood, and we have all of this slash from logging very, very close to this area. Eventually, the glass company ends up having to purchase coal. And so what happens is the sparks coming out of the factory actually set on fire the 600 cords of wood, and then you get a big wind. And that ends up setting all the forests in these areas on fire. Again, that's 25,000 acres of Sandwich and Bourne that all end up on fire. Again, we also have dry conditions. We have a strong breeze that's taking those embers and spreading them. And this, of course, turns it into a major forest fire. So the Sandwich Glass Company tries to weather this fire and eventually turns to coal as its primary fuel source. Because the forest burnt down and their easy source of fuel has just burnt down. So they turn to coal. There's a number of worker strikes that are going on at this time, which actually ends up ending the Sandwich Glass Company, because this was actually one of the largest industrial businesses on the Cape for about 60 years. And this fire, in combination with a couple other things, really takes down the company and impacts all of these towns. And here is actually a picture of the smoke coming off that fire. So our next one is the big blow up. This is the big burn. You guys have just watched a video about that, but it's always worth mentioning because, again, this has a huge impact on forest fire policy. We have the fledgling forest department that is around. We see from this fire, this transformation of the forest department into firefighting. And the big blow up actually has a number of places where this fire is. Here is Wallace. This is where the story mostly takes place when we watch the video. If you ever go up to Wallace, it is still surrounded by forests and everything like that. It's actually a very pretty place. I've been up to Wallace a couple times, as well as out in Lolo, in the Lolo forest. So this area, again, we have a lot of logging. We have that slash and burn going on, 80 miles an hour wind. The firebrands are being thrown 10 miles, even with forest fighting techniques that we have today with planes and tankers and helicopters and all the technology we have today. The spread of 10 miles at a time is really tough to keep up with. So we see a lot of death. We see the civilians. We see a lot of timber that is lost. And again, the fire impacts not just the Forest Service and the individuals in the area. We see smoke as far away as Boston. So we got smoke going all the way across the country. And again, this is the area that really kicks up our modern forest fire policies, right? All fires must be out by 10 a.m. the next day. That becomes the saying. We see the development of the Pulaski as a tool. We see the organization of the Forest Department into a firefighting service in the national forests. We see this modeled in state forest fighting agencies. Like here we have CAL FIRE, We have similar agencies all over the country modeling themselves after the policies that occur from the big blow up. Now, this one is up in Canada. I bring this one up because this is about North America, and Canadian policy often reflects our policy, right? They're our closest neighbor, our closest trading partner. We share a lot of resources with them, including our forests. And so what happens in our forest doesn't just stay in our forest. It's not like forest fires go, oh, wait, we can't go into Canada without a passport. Our fires go into Canada, Canada's fires come to us. So it's important that we have good conversations with our neighbors about firefighting. Same with on the Mexican border, we have a lot more desert down there. But environmental policies are really important for us to converse with both of our neighbors. So just like in Peshtigo and a number of the other fires that we've just talked about, settlers had slashed and burnt the land. They were coming into the area from Iroquois Falls. They had huge amounts of settlers coming into the area. And one, we have a big desire for lumber in order to build these towns. Lumber, we also want to clear this land for having farms. And so we have a lot of slash. We have a lot of, we have a hot, dry summer. We have a lack of rain coming in. And this actually starts as several smaller fires that happen around the area that eventually converge into a firestorm or a fire complex. Here in California, we call them complexes. And so this becomes a fire complex. And it destroyed 49 towns. The firestorm was really huge. It reached 64 kilometers across at one point. That's a lot of space. And it was, there's a number of communities that had actually been burnt down, like the community of Cochrane. This was the third time a fire had destroyed this community in a 6-year period. Now, I want you to imagine what it would be like if your town burnt down 3 times in 6 years, and how you're going to be rethinking maybe where you live, assuming you made it through the fire, but also the types of policies you want to be implementing in your area in order to do something about the fact that your town keeps burning down. So this ends up being one of the key fires that leads to the creation of the Forest Protection Branch of the Department of Lands, Forests, and Mines, now known today as the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry up in Canada. We also see the passing of the Forest Fires Prevention Act in Ontario. And this policy changes how the population saw forest fires and forestry. So we have a big public awareness campaign that starts happening. We see the development of a provincial level, for the provinces are like our states, a provincial level forest firefighting department. So that's like creating CAL FIRE as opposed to the San Luis Obispo Fire Department, right, for the town. We see the shifting of policies around fire and fire suppression. Canada starts to also adopt this, put your fire out as quick as possible. This real negative view comes out of a lot of these forest fires about fire in the forests. It's something to be feared. It's something we should press. The best fire is no fire. And this becomes both Canada and the United States' policy for the next 100 years. So this is, just about 100 years ago. So these policies, these fires implement and influence how we engage in forest fire policy and fire suppression and logging and all of those other sorts of things. And so also we want to know, what does this tell us about the future of fire in North America? So we've had 100 years of fire suppression. Now, we've talked about the fact that fire does some very important work for us. It helps keep the forest clean. Well, if you have 100 years of fire suppression, you have 100 years of the forest not being clean. You have a lot of brush buildup and everything like that. And of course, when I put this together in October, this was the latest map. We are not in drought anymore. Thank you, Mother Patterns. But we were in drought, and we were in significant drought, but it wasn't just us. Look at the drought in the rest of the country. Now, again, I want you to think through that map that showed fire return. Here's where the fires are going to be. Here's where we're having drought. All of the fires we just talked about were during droughts, right? You had very low rainfall, drying out fuels. So these droughts that we are starting to have more often are having a huge impact on fires in North America, because those drought cycles are drying out fuels, trees are stressed out, and they're not as able to defend themselves against pests and infections, so they're dying more, so we're ending up with even more fuels out in the fire. We have everybody being water stressed, and so this is leading to a real potential for the continuation and expansion of much more significant fires in our future. And it's not just here in the West. We often talk about fires in the West in this class. Matter of fact, we often talk about fires in the West in the United States because the West has a lot of fires. But we are seeing more fires in the East as well. We have the Wharton State Forest Fire in June of 2022. This was the largest fire in New Jersey in quite some time. North Carolina saw 5,000 acres of wildlands. This is the third most in the country in 2021 after California and Texas, right? So we don't really think of North Carolina, which is right over here, as a major fireplace. And yet the third most amount of fire behind Texas and California happened in North Carolina. The Great Smoky Mountain Complex, right? So here's North Carolina, here's Tennessee. It's happening up here in Tennessee and the southern part of Kentucky. The Gatlinburg Fire, another huge fire complex that happens in 2016. And of course, we're seeing fire risks all throughout the Appalachian Mountains significantly increase as well, especially as we start to get a lot more weather weirding. We did not have a lot. We in California had a ton of precipitation this year, but the East Coast didn't have a ton of precipitation. In fact, they had a freakishly warm winter. They did not get a lot of snow, which means that those areas are going to be drying out if they don't get rain this summer. This whole area over here has a tendency to get more rain during the summer, which is part of the reason why we don't have a ton of drought. Now, there's a couple different types of drought. We have these long-term sustained droughts like what we've been having here. But if you have an incredibly dry summer in an area that is used to wet, that can dry these fuels out pretty quickly as well. So when we think through the future of fire outside of the West, we really need to be thinking through shifting up and understanding what should the fire regimes be? How should we be engaging with fire? And what is the best way for us to do that? So this concludes the Historic Fires lecture, and have a good one, everybody.